Hello. Tell me the saddest story in the world, and tell it to me in stale language or received forms, and I might fail to respond, sadly. These days, news of crisis passes over us 24 hours of the day, certainly for me, in waves that desensitize us, seem to numb us, even as they also haunt us into doom scrolling deep into the night. At least for me. But I think it's fair to say that it is a task of art, though not its job, to respond to the world in a way that renews the world's reality for us. And reality is these days so relentlessly mediated, our days incessantly punctuated, for good and ill, by tweets and CNN scrolls, at least this week, and bureaucratic admin. The romantic poet Wordsworth once wrote in a sonnet of his that I love, "The world is too much with us," lamenting the ways that reality imposes on our imaginations. A modern update might lament, TikTok is too much with us. Twitter is too much with us. The news is too much with us. Reality is too much with us. Into the fray comes art that restores us, arrests us, stops us in our tracks, and I think mediates between the smooth, glassy abstraction of the lyric and the pearl grit pull of narrative, or at least that's the art we're going to hear today. We're going to hear from two writers who write about desire, and in particular queer desire, in an age of crisis. Maggie Millner is a senior editor at the Yale Review and author of the extraordinary debut Couplets, a love story, which has basically received all the praise from all the critics, The New Yorker, The New York Times, and more. It's being translated into multiple languages. I've had the incredible pleasure and honor of reading Maggie's work for many years, since I can't say she was a student in my class. She sat in my class, and I learned from her. Garth Greenwell is the author of What Belongs to You, which was long-listed for the National Book Awards, and most recently of Cleanness, which was named a top 10 book of the year by the New York Times, which is amazing, and also named a best book of the year by, it seems, every single extant magazine. It was actually reassuring to read the list. There were many more magazines existing than I thought. It's an incredible book. He is a recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship, among many other literary honors. Crucially, we've gathered them together because they both understand that desire, sex, loss, none of these subjects matter as art until the writer has figured out the form that can contain experience. We were just talking about this in the masterclass. Metabolizing crisis and desire into a persuasive aesthetic object. Building styles of their own, each uses constraint to remind us of the expansive range of human feeling, whether it be pleasure or imperilment. For both, the transformation of desire, whether into a long poem in the case of Millner's Couplets, or short stories in the case of Garth Greenwell's Cleanness, is built on the foundational concept that style is an essential cornerstone of Eros. Eros, the sweet bitter, as the poet Sappho once put it, is not just a pull toward the beloved, desired other, but as much a measure of our distance from them, a distance inscribed by longing, a longing that I think, these writers tell me, only style in art can adequately convey. And that is because style is longing, as both these writers know. That is to say, these are both artists for whom the attempt to put into language what can never be adequately said is as much a subject as their themes of shame, abasement, abjection, and indeed education. If both are writing in different ways about desire as a theme, they are also writing about writing as desire. A desire animated by the formal restraints and constraints we find in Couplets, a love story and coming out story in rhymed couplets, containing and propelling narrative. And we find in Greenwell's stories of the irreducible ambiguity, to borrow a phrase from Joan Didion, of Eros as a state of both subjection and overcoming. As Greenwell writes in a story from Cleanness, in which the narrator is visiting a gallery and looking at art with his boyfriend in Bologna, quote, "The brushstrokes were imperfect too, visible, haphazard, the paint distributed unevenly, inexpertly. But that wasn't right. Really, it was striving for something ideal. That was what I felt, the frequency I wanted to catch. And here is Maggie Millner on her narrator's reflection of how to live. Quote, finding for one's time on earth a shape that feels more native than imposed, a shape in which desire, having chosen it, can multiply. Let's see, I've lost my place because I'm so overcome by that, which I am. So while they're both interested in abjection and shame, as I think you may hear tonight, they explore that interest in prose that gleams and thrills, pivoting from a kind of disarming precision to a candor that destabilizes. As they explore queer identity and rewrite queer literary histories, they make luminous shapes in language. Then they fill those shapes with truths that are hard to say and cannot be made tidy. The result are narratives that toy with the illumination of lyric and dart back to the shadow of event we can't name or understand clearly. Writing that suggests and withdraws, revels and mourns, and above all names the oscillations of desire within it, that it saves us to say or hear named clearly. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you so much, Megan, for that beautiful introduction. And thank you, everyone, for being here. It's such an honor to be reading with Garth Greenwell. Cleanness was one of the books that I was reading while I was writing this book, actually. And so it feels so appropriate that we're reading together and that we're reading here at Yale among so many people who have been so important to me as an editor and as a teacher and as a writer and as a reader, including Megan, without whom this book probably would not exist. So thank you all for being here. I'm going to read several poems from throughout the book. I'm going to read them in the order in which they appear and just pause between each section. They're not individually titled, which was a expedient choice on my part. So I'll just pause between each section as I go. Couplets. I became myself. I became myself. No, I always was myself. There's no such person as myself. I wouldn't have to turn my eye inward, I thought, if I could train my eye on him, the one I loved. But I was wrong. My eye loved everything it fell upon. And then one day, it fell upon a mirror, and he was nowhere in the mirror, and she was everywhere. All my life I've shown up late, but when I do, I compensate for my delay. I laugh and preen and carry on as if I had been present all along. I stayed in utero, for instance, 2 weeks after I was due, then came out so decisively and fast I couldn't breathe. I spent my first night on Earth alone inside a tent flushed full of oxygen, the event from which, my dad believes, have sprung like fires all my weird anxieties. Mostly I can't see myself at all until I sense in someone else a parallel. Like how I only realize what I want at the moment I attain it, my mind the final part of me to know. I've hurt people I love being so late to my desires. Last year, I met someone I thought I couldn't live without, and in the process lost another without whom I thought I'd die. If I had only realized sooner, etc., etc. But I handled things ineptly, and he left. I didn't die. Instead, I went to therapy and saw the stegosaur uptown, stayed with friends and drank a lot of tea. Even then, riding the bus to visit my new lover, I was breathless always, early, almost never. She found me in the winter at a bar, one of those places in Bed-Stuy, not far from Clinton Hill. a platonic meeting set up by a friend who worked in media and thought we'd get along. I got there first and snatched a booth and started reading Middlemarch, a novel I've been halfway through for more than half my life. When she strode through the door, "Oh shit, I love that book. I've read it 15 times, she said, and asked my favorite scene. I looked down at page 98, open on the table. Maybe when Lydgate first meets Dorothea, and Eliot's talking about how the, quote, stealthy convergence of human lots, unquote, when analyzed in retrospect, shows a, quote, slow preparation of effects from one life on another, unquote, I replied. Totally, she said. The conversation turned to poetry, our few mutual friends, one's PhD, one's startup, one's divorce. I was too skittish and caught up in my charade to feel charging the space between us like a ray, the knowing gaze of destiny, which Eliot would say, stood by sarcastic with our dramatis personae folded in her hand. Besides, I practically had a husband, a man as opposite to her as Casaubon was opposite to Will. On the A train home, I read that paragraph again, then closed the book and marked the chapter, telling myself that I'd resume it after. I thought she thought my life was trivial, since she was queer and edited periodicals, and I was a poet who had never dated a woman. Every night she'd attend some trendy function with people dressed in Eckhouse and Givenchy, while I shambled off to walk-in shows at raunchy bars, or raunchier bars that never put on shows. Or anyway, that was my perception. Now I know that hers were mostly networking events, book launches and openings, their settings often even spots where I'd have grabbed a drink myself. Still, when I surveyed the fabric of my life back then, its familiar open work of sex and teaching, Kale and NPR, and the boyfriend at the center I revered but felt I had been failing many years, I dreaded she'd dismiss me. Though when I looked at him and at my friends, I thought, how bad could my life really be with people like these in it? Gentle, loyal, practical, considerate. The difference was I knew my friends, I knew my life, while hers remained a vivid new reality that swirled behind a scintillating door, a world where people wore athleisure haute and seemed to vape incessantly, the sticks lighting up green or white like tiny pagers every time they'd pull. I hated the air that came out of them, the smell like cleaning solvent or an afterthought of fruit, but found them mesmerizing too. I'd zone out and imagine that a tiny person lived inside each cartridge who would sprint to switch the light bulb on and fan the fire when she felt a drag. She must get so tired, I would think. This elaborate e-cig reverie was not so different from my theory of her life, which, because unknown, was also marvelous and false, complete invention. It took months to really reach her through the cloud of myth my adoration made. Until I could, I lived in fear she'd finally see my fetish and discrepancy and flee. I tried to stay away from her. Could not. I'd turn to J or T and say, today's the day it stops. Nothing right should feel this dirty, nothing real this quicksilver and fanged. I kept thinking of that show, My Strange Addiction, which was enjoying a comeback among my peers in those months, despite its cancellation years before, conceptual depravity, and total exploitation of its cast. Reality TV seemed newly relevant, I guess, as life itself grew ever more fictitious, perpendicular to time. Obsession was a subject that obsessed me, regardless of its object, but I hated watching strangers getting hurt by theirs, doll collecting, surgery, ingesting dirt and glass. There was no joy depicted, just decrepitude, abjection, musty rooms. If I directed one, my show would air the pleasures of compulsion and be named, "Screw it, I'm going to text her." Or, "Nothing's wrong, you're just in love again." Or, "True Life, turning 28 in Brooklyn." Now and then, I'd get the strange impression that she was me. A stab of chthonic recognition would set off a little spasm in my eye. Sometimes from far away, I'd spy her slanted walk or messy hair, and every muscle in my body would contract. At school, when I should have been correcting exams, I'd scroll through photos on her Instagram, the fabric growing damp between my legs where her finger liked to press itself inside me like a key. An undiscovered ancestor, an eidolon, an isomer, and an uncanny sense of unity to love in her what had always seemed deformity in me. To yield, to feel the snugness of the fit, to turn the lock, to hear the little click. Other times, I could feel myself become him. Those tics I'd found most tiresome, his artificial cheer, his trick of going silent in the heat of conflict, or accusing me of being self-indulgent without ever specifying what he meant, suddenly belonged to me, my temper having lifted in our time together some properties of his. His ideas crowded my head as if through an earpiece. His hand's phantom weight guided my own. His scowl in my mirror, and in my microphone, his speech, down to the voice's note of spite, the patronizing diagnosis, the words I'd used to scold her when she told a tasteless joke. It was the same old dialectic I had tried to leave behind. This is partly why I thought I'd lost my mind. But when she'd start to plunge into depression, as I've often done, curled in bed or prostrate on the ground, listing all the people she'd let down, it was by remembering how he'd soothed me that I soothed her. And when I held her cheek against my cheek, I was drawing from the well of love he filled. So I became, after all, not him exactly, but a kind of conduit between them, a conversation they conducted with my mouth. And when I was not unbelievably sad, I was moved unbelievably to hold inside me both my lovers and to introduce them to each other, there, in the hollow, just above the heart, among the little folds where the voice starts. Some mornings, leaving my girlfriend's house, I'd glimpse my whole existence, all its eras, as a single arc, unified, unbroken. I saw a person who kissed mostly men, wrote poems in the prevailing style, owned a cat. I saw a different person after that, and before I saw a little girl. What was I saying? That there were these different selves. I need you to see them. They were shapes made out of lines, and then one day they all began to cross the lines, as if by some obscure design, the analysis of which became the purpose of my life. Or maybe the pattern was my life, and its analysis merely my living. Sexuality is, after all, a formal concern, finding for one's time on earth a shape that feels more native than imposed, a shape in which desire, having chosen it, can multiply. And isn't love itself a type of rhyme? And don't gender and genre share one root? Maybe I really am a poet, needing as I do from these imperfect sets which constitute a self, the lie of sense. And this is the last poem I'll read, and it's dedicated to all the undergrads in the room. That fall, I'd rush out of her bed to catch the 7 o'clock train to the college I taught composition at. Supporting claims, active voice, citation format. The difference between summary and analysis was a large part of the syllabus, so much so you could say the line between them was the joist on which the whole semester leaned. I think I really liked the teaching, with its emphasis on logic and slow reading, another cornerstone of the curriculum, but also a constraint I'd always suffered from, having no other choice. Before that, I had only ever taught poetry, which had no claim to usefulness, alas, though it allowed me to give out more A's. And in my current role, felt duty-bound to teach my students everything I wished I'd found out about at their age. Evidence must precede argument. Verbs are the heaviest lifters. Change is constant and inexorable. The Oxford comma isn't really optional. You will fall in love. The relationship will end, though not at the same instant as the love. Some version of this will continue, maybe forever, happening to you. Restate your thesis in the final paragraph. You can fuck up and still be fine. Remember that. Always include a bibliography. Don't promise your life to anybody.
I'm so happy to be here. I'm so thrilled to read in the space created by those poems. Thank you to everyone. Thank you to Meghan. Thank you to Will. Thank you to Sonia, Sam, to everyone at the review. Thank you to everyone responsible for these flowers. Thank you to all of you for being here, to yesterday's panel with Catherine Lofton, with Emily Bernard, with Meghan O'Rourke. We talked yesterday about shame and about the kinds of knowledge, the kinds of thinking and feeling that maybe are only available from within shame. And so I'm going to read today, a lot of my work has been about shame, and some of my work has been about humiliation, humiliation inflicted or humiliation sought out, the kinds of pleasure that humiliation makes possible. This excerpt is also about shame and humiliation. I think it's the scariest thing I've ever written. I've never read it before in public. It comes from quite late in this novel that I've just finished, just handed in, that will be coming out at some point from FSG. The novel is called Small Rain. The narrator at this point has been in the hospital for about 10 days after suffering a very serious, a potentially fatal health crisis. This is it's the morning maybe of his last day. He spent the night, it's his first night in the general ward after 9 days in the cardiovascular ICU, and they've told him that he might be able to get home if they can make some things happen that day. I have to tell you just a few things. Every day he's in the hospital, he has to give himself a bath. He has all sorts of tubes in him, and so he can't take a shower. He has these horrible wipes that he has to use, these disinfectant wipes, like industrial grade, that he has to use on himself. In the ICU, they would warm them up. He discovers that in the general ward, they don't. He's a poet. Oh, wait, no. So he's giving himself a bath, and then he's going to remember an earlier bath, which happened several days earlier after he has a very scary setback and is put on complete bed rest. And the nurse, the primary nurse who takes care of him, who's a woman named Olivia, bathes him. He's a poet. He has a partner named Elle, who is also a poet from Spain. They've been together for 7 years. This happens at the height of the pandemic, and Elle can only come for about an hour a day. think that's all you need to know. Oh, I bragged last night. I told everyone I was so proud of myself because I was going to read really short. I'm not going to read long. But so this thing I was planning to read takes about 15 minutes. And then after that, I'm going to read, because of a conversation I had last night, I'm going to read a much, much shorter section as well. I'll talk about that when I get to it. So this nurse in the main ward has just left, telling him he needs to give himself a bath. I sat up once she had left. Even that was complicated. I had to curl my hands into fists, not tightly, which put pressure somehow on the metal nub of the arterial line bound against my wrist with tape. I curled them into loose fists, and then, as gently as I could, trying not to jostle the needles snug in my veins, I slowly pushed myself up. I leaned forward to untangle the blanket from my legs, setting it to one side, and then I swung my legs, though swung isn't the word for the gradual, slow movement I made over the bed's other side, pivoting my torso after them. Even moving as slowly as I could, there was a threat of dizziness, a wave that only slowness, only stillness kept from cresting. I made a sound at this point. Every time I sat up, a long sighed, whoa. The sound my grandfather made to cattle when they rushed up steaming on winter mornings wanting their feed, a calming sound. Whoa. I uncovered it then, my animal body. I undid the snaps of the gown, which I wasn't sure I would be able to do up again without help, and let it fall, then pulled it out from under me where I sat on it. I couldn't reach the plastic bag with my underwear. The windowsill was just 1 or 2 steps away, but it wasn't worth it, I decided. I would go home that day. I would change them there. Nor was it worth it to take off my socks, which anyway I wasn't sure I could manage. Olivia had always helped me with it, and I guessed I wouldn't change the stickers with the electrodes either, since the nurse hadn't said anything about them, though Olivia had replaced them every day, always clipping the wires back on with her little rhyme, grass is green, smoke above fire. I would clean around them. I would do the best I could. I pulled open the package and made a face at the foul smell. They were almost unbearably cold. I could hardly force myself to run them over my skin, which puckered with gooseflesh. I had never thanked Olivia for warming them. I had taken it for granted, as I had taken for granted the way she wiped down my back and my feet. I had never thanked her, not even when she washed my whole body, which she only did the one time, when I was on absolute bed rest. She told me to lie back, to relax, to move as little as possible as she washed me. She started with my legs, beginning above the knee, but not too far above, well below my underwear. She dragged the warm cloth down the front of my leg first, then cupped her palm around my ankle, my left ankle, and lifted it up. She chastised me for lifting it myself. That's just what we want to keep you from doing, she said. Let me lift it. We don't want those muscles working at all. She was thorough but quick, entirely professional. So I can't explain why it felt so intimate to release the weight of the limb into her hand as she ran the cloth down the back of my leg, except that I'm more sensitive there, especially on the back of my knee. And I remembered suddenly how once, years before, 15 years more, how is it possible a man I had been flirting with at a bar touched me there? I had been talking to someone else, one of his friends whom we were facing together side by side, when surreptitiously, without my noticing, but how did he manage it? I can't figure out the logistics now. We were at a little table, I think. Maybe I was standing and he was perched on a stool. This was in Avignon, the first summer I had spent abroad. It was August or July, and I was a little drunk, I think, on gin, and on the summer, too, on this man beside me I liked, on the pleasure of knowing we were each of us steering the night toward the same conclusion, on the pleasure of French, which I had studied for years but never really used, not like this, surrounded by it, immersed. It still seemed amazing to me somehow that the language worked. It was like a magic trick to speak and be understood, like the suspension of gravity or breathing underwater, a violation of natural laws. He was my age, 20-something, an actor performing in the festival, not in any glamorous way. He was a local boy, an extra, or maybe something a little more than an extra. I never saw him perform. He touched me surreptitiously, so lightly, that at first I thought it was a breeze against my legs. I was in shorts that summer, a ridiculous American in shorts, though it was in that little window of time when I was fit, or almost fit, and I was young enough that maybe it was charming to be ridiculous. That was something he said to me at some point. It only lasted a few days, our little affair, and on one of them he said to me, "T'es charmant," which was pure romance, a moment of pure romance. So slowly that it might have been the wind, he touched the back of my knee with a single finger, tracing feather-light and slow a little line, and then again and again, stroking just an inch or two of skin that lit up the whole surface of my body, and not just my body, his body too, I'm sure. It was our first private touch. It made a circuit between us. It must have lit up the air all around so that though I'm sure I didn't visibly react, his friend responded right away, feeling the change of weather. He left us to ourselves. I hadn't thought of that for years. I'm not sure I had ever thought of it again after that summer, which had other, more substantial adventures, but my body had remembered it. That inch or two of my body, how lovely that it had remembered it, triggered by so different a touch by Olivia smearing me with the foul hospital disinfectant. It bathed me in fondness for that boy. What was his name and that moment for the boy I was in that moment? All of this came in a flash, instantaneous, time taken out of time, compressed the way memories compress when they lodge in the body, in taste or smell, in touch, when they leapfrog language and therefore time. It was as present to me as when it had happened. That boy with his long hair. I remembered the way in bed it fell around my face like a curtain or a veil, the taste of his mouth, the wind in the plane trees outside my room, that ocean sounding in their leaves. All of it came in the instant before Olivia set my left foot down and took up the right. She wiped down one arm then, and after that the other, lifting those two. She was on my right side and leaned over for my left arm. Only then did she take off my gown. She undid the snaps at the shoulders and put her hand under my back. I was sitting almost upright. They did allow that. I could position the bed how I wanted, to help me lean forward so she could pull the gown free. "Stay like that a minute," she said, taking her hand away long enough to open a second package of wipes, one of which she used to wash my back. "Now for the fun part." "There's no good way," she said, as she always did, unclipping the wires from the stickers on my chest, fast or slow, giving me the choice, and as always I said fast, get it over with. One of the stickers was always falling off 2 or 3 times a day. An alarm sounded, and I would find it dangling from its wire in my gown. She plucked that one first, and then for each of the others she pressed one finger to its edge, holding the skin in place, and then pulled quickly but gently, as if she were afraid the skin might tear, as maybe it could. It stung each time. It pulled out hair and left behind outlines of adhesive, dark, grimy circles of dirt and fabric from the gown, sticky to the touch. She used a different cleaner for these circles. The disinfectant didn't take them off. There were little pads with some kind of specialized agent for adhesive, and even these never quite got it all. I had closed my eyes while she was pulling off the stickers, squeezing them tight against the pain, but more against my reaction to the pain. I didn't want Olivia to see me flinch. I'm not sure why. Maybe it was a kind of politeness to hide my discomfort. She saw it anyway. "I know it hurts," she said. "I'm sorry." I opened my eyes as she cleaned off the adhesive. The pads cold on my skin so that when she touched the sides of my stomach where I'm ticklish, I drew in my breath. I think usually I would have shut my eyes again. I don't like looking at myself, at my torso especially. I try not to see myself in mirrors, even clothed on the street. I avert my eyes from shop windows as I pass, whether the image is distorted or true. I don't like the look of myself. But I looked at myself now. Poor body, I thought. My stomach was covered in bruises. Each heparin shot 3 times a day had left a mark, dark brown where they were freshest and yellowish as they faded like punches from tiny fists. They were running out of space for new shots. Poor body. I had felt so much shame for what I saw. The pectorals, which had been muscle once briefly for a year or two, sagging, the nipples dark and large, tight now, puckered from the cold, and beneath them the rolls of my stomach, 3 rolls of fat I had had since I was a child. My sister had always laughed at them, my older sister, the one I was estranged from now. She would pinch them and call me fat and laugh, the cruelty of children. 3 rolls of flesh that grew progressively larger, like an image of a wave receding, though the last, the lowest, broad where it curved, seemed lunar to me somehow as I lay back upright. As Olivia took the final wipe from the package, she had done the best she could with the adhesive, which would linger for days, impossible to scrub away. The cloth was warm at first, pleasant. She was gentle as she started at my chest, wiping across and then moving down, lifting my arms again to wipe my armpits. The liquid left a kind of shine on my skin, which was pale even at the end of summer, because I never uncovered myself, not since I was a child. For years, even with lovers, I refused to take off my shirt, and I'm not sure I can remember ever being shirtless outside. It's ridiculous how much the thought horrifies me, even now, when I do take off my shirt in front of others, when I've learned there are men turned on by it in back rooms and bathrooms, when I let men press their faces into my stomach and chest, sucking on my nipples or burrowing under my arms. All through my 20s, I couldn't bear it, but now I strip down without hesitation, and still I can't imagine taking off my shirt in public, even at the height of summer, even at the swimming pool or the beach, which are places I avoid anyway. There's a poem I love, by a man I heard read once at the university in Ann Arbor, a famous poet, a great poet, I think. He was a huge man, and already old then. He's dead now several years. And it was difficult for him to move. He lumbered, so that I thought how hard it must have been for him to travel. It's hard for me, and he was much larger than I was. Even at my heaviest, he must have been 400 pounds or more. He has a poem I've never forgotten about being shirtless at the beach, feeling himself looked at by the other bathers with pity or amazement or disgust, politely or with pointed fingers, how he waits for open derision, and finally it comes. The pistol-shot laughter, he writes, which of course you can't respond to. However painfully it strikes, you have to act as though you haven't felt it. You have to seem insensible, imperturbable. Whatever dignity you can salvage depends on that. Bare body is not equal ever. That's another line I remember from the poem. And I remember how moved I was by him at the podium, distinguished, honored, reading about a humiliation I had felt and had never seen described in a poem. I had spent so much time avoiding that laughter, trying to avoid it. I had given up so much. I had let it, the fact of it or its specter, determine so much of my life. I had never felt the sun on my chest or my stomach, not a single time I could remember, so that the skin was moonish and pale, with 5 or 6 small moles. I've always had them, lunares, they're called in Spanish, a beautiful word, moon marks. El had taught it to me, pressing his finger to them as we lay naked together, one of the first days I had spent in his bed, learning to be with him like that, hungry for each other, then satisfied, then hungry again, lunares. Where my stomach was broadest, it was streaked with even paler vertical lines, stretch marks. I have them at my shoulders too, but they're darker. They're a pinkish color, almost blue in spots on my stomach. They're white. I've had them too as long as I can remember. My father saw them once. I was maybe 12 or 13, and he came to a doctor's appointment with me. I don't know why. He didn't usually come. And I remember my mortification as the doctor examined me, making me take my shirt off while my father was in the room. And then when the doctor stepped out and I struggled into my clothes again as quick as I could, I remember my father's disgust. Jesus, he said, did you fill out so fast you got stretch marks? That was how I learned what they were called. Olivia was thorough. The broad swipe she made across my chest and stomach left the hair there matted and wet. Not that I'm very hairy, not as hairy as I'd like. I wish I could qualify as a bear. It would help with my erotic life. So many guys fetishize it, as I do too, I guess. The hair I have is thickest in the middle of my chest and then again low on my stomach where it grows toward the navel. And it was thinner now than usual because so much had been torn out by the stickers for the electrodes, a new strip of which Olivia was fetching from the cupboard, having thrown away the used wipes. What a strange thing a body is, I thought. How eerie to be filled with blood and covered with hair, to be a machine any part of which might fail, and how strange to have hated it so much, when it had always been so serviceable, when it had done more or less everything I had needed until now, when for more than 40 years it had worked so well. Poor body, I thought again, looking down on it. I had hated it so much and been so ashamed, and I might have loved it instead, I thought suddenly. It had been all that time available for love, and it had never occurred to me to love it. It would have seemed impossible, as it seemed impossible now. I don't think Elle knew how much I hated it. I had learned to hide it by the time we met, to act unashamed, and if not to enjoy being naked with him, at least to bear it. But maybe he did know. Maybe that was why he slept the way he did, with one hand on my stomach, why he loved to touch me there, and not just when we were sleeping. He would come up behind me at all hours of the day and reach under my shirt, and on the couch too, reading or watching a movie. He always wanted to touch me there. If I pushed his hand away, he would reach for me again. Maybe he had sensed what I felt and wanted to teach me a different feeling. I don't know. But there are feelings we don't get to have, I thought as I washed myself alone with the cold wipes smelling foul. There are lessons we can't learn. Or maybe that's not true. Maybe I just needed more time. Maybe I could still get over myself, I thought. Maybe Elle would teach me yet. Last night I had a really very beautiful and moving conversation with Emily Bernard, meeting whom I've known her work for a long time. Her first book, a biography of Carl van Vechten, has been for years for me a model of morally engaged reading and thinking about others. But meeting her in person has been so wonderful. It's been just, as the French say, un coup de foudre, a lightning bolt. And after that conversation, I wanted to read this second, much shorter section. It won't last very long, I promise, just a couple of paragraphs. It's from much earlier in the novel. What I just read was from the last section, the fifth. This is from the second. I don't know what to do with my phone. And I should say just how this all started. So the narrator had an experience one day, very suddenly. There was an onset of just like disfiguring, dehumanizing, obliterating pain. And because he's dumb, and because he's from a family of tobacco farmers in Kentucky, and also because it was the height of the pandemic, he refused, despite his partner's pleading, for 5 days to go to the hospital. When he goes to the hospital, and when they finally, after 6 hours of waiting, because he lives in America, when they finally see him, and when he finally gets a CT scan, kind of all hell breaks loose. Because what's happened is that his aorta has torn. And one of the first things one of the surgeons says to him in the emergency room is, "You could die." And he's surrounded by people when he says this, and there's like a shudder in the room. There's this sense of like, he has said this forbidden, taboo thing. And the surgeon who actually takes on the narrator's care says, "You're not going to die." And from that moment, the narrator feels like everyone is lying to him, that they're not giving it to him straight. Well, on his second night, a doctor comes, whom he knows slightly from outside the hospital, and gives it to him straight and scares the shit out of him and tells him that he's lucky because at 5 days untreated with what happened to him, the mortality rate is 75%. And, he tells him this is bad, like you're going through something really bad. And after that, the narrator does what you should never do in this situation, which is he does a Google search. And he finds really scary figures. And I'll just start there. And then there were statistics for the longer term. For patients under treatment, 60% survival rate at 5 years, 40% at a decade. Oh, and I just want to say thank you, Emily, for our conversation. I closed the computer. I didn't want to read more. 5 years, I thought. Even at 5 years, the odds weren't great, and the deaths in the study were from sudden rupture of the artery, quick and without particular warning, the kind of death I had brushed against when I was gripped suddenly by pain out of the blue, standing in the kitchen one moment. It was morning, the start of the day, and then bent double blind with pain. It had brushed past the great banality, not grand and literary, but a brute crushing fact, a hammer pounding meat. It frightened me, the thought of only a few years, of how little I could do, the things I had imagined making after my long preparation. I had only just begun. When had I started to believe that I had time, that I would get to be an old man? I hadn't believed it always. As a teenager, I had assumed life would be short, too short to prepare for anything. In those years when I failed my classes and made my mother despair, when life was only long enough for appetite, it seemed to me that any life worth living could only be short. That was the only bargain I saw in the men who were dying around me, and it was a terrible bargain, but one I took without hesitating. What was the other option? What could I do with all that time? What was the life my life was preparing me for? And then the dumb luck of not getting sick, though I had been so reckless, though I had taken no precautions, had done everything that anyone who did get sick had done, that the friends I had just begun to make had done, the dumbest luck. And then, too, the luck of music, of having a talent that could carry me to another world, the opening up of a future that I came to care about, the future I still cared about. I wanted to be old. I wanted to work until I was old. I wanted to see what I could do. I mean, the poems I could write, and also the life I could make with Elle. I thought of the Gospel of St. Thomas, the line everyone quotes about bringing forth what is inside you. But then its corollary, that darker promise Jesus makes, that what you do not bring forth will destroy you. They were terms I could understand, of being lost or saved by what one made or failed to make, and I had brought forth so little. I had laid up all my treasures for that future time I wouldn't have now, maybe, the time that had been cut short. I was being stupid, I thought. Or really, I had been stupid before, stupid to have let myself be lulled. I had been wiser as a child. There were no guarantees. It was ridiculous to imagine life at 60 or 70, to think of the future as a broad passage and avenue, when really it was a narrow corridor of slamming doors. But that isn't true either. Planning for the future or living for the moment, nobody knows how to live. There's no way to know. Anything anyone says is bullshit, entirely arbitrary, true or false by chance. There are no arts of living, I thought. I looked to the window, though the shade was drawn. Beyond it was the tower where I knew children's oncology was housed. Olivia had told me when I had asked her earlier in the day. Why should I feel aggrieved, I thought. If you want injustice, look there. Dying at 45 or 50 isn't unjust, so you haven't seized every moment of your life. Who has? People die young every day, I said to myself. Younger than you. Why act like it's such a tragedy? But none of it helped. I was aggrieved, more than aggrieved. I felt enraged. not just at some abstraction, at fate or death or chance, but at actual concrete beings, at the doctors for whom I was not an infinitely cherishable bundle of pathos and need, but an interesting case, at the nurses I heard chattering through the day at their desk outside my room, at absolutely everyone not facing what I faced, what I felt I was facing, even at Elle. The closeness I had felt with him earlier was gone. Now there was a great gulf, and I was on one side of it alone. If I died, what would I be for him but a story? Not even my own story, but a segment of his, larger or smaller. I would be something he lived past, something he got over, an elegy's inspiration, maybe. Where did it come from, that rage? And where did it go? After a moment, as suddenly as it came, I watched it as it went, merely afraid again. The great banality, I repeated to myself, commoner than dirt, inspiring a scale of feeling that was ridiculous the moment it passed, as was true of all the immensities of love and oceans and the night sky filled with stars. Everyone is ridiculous seeing them for the first time, when feeling swells to match them and is laughable for trying, grotesque with bigness. Why should death be any different? Where is your philosophy now? I ask myself. But human beings aren't ever philosophical, I think. Not really. At least I was the opposite of philosophical. A minuscule, crouching thing. A bit of matter, terribly afraid, utterly insignificant. The entire world. Thank you.
That was amazing.
That was amazing.
That was
Thanks,
amazing.
you guys.
I've gone to a lot of readings. That was amazing. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Maggie, thank you. That was amazing. I was going to ask you a different question, but I actually, I want to ask about risk. Mm-hmm. We've talked about shame. We talked about shame yesterday. Both of you are writing a little bit directly about themes of shame, but there is also risk involved. How do you think about risk as writers aesthetically? How do you navigate it? How do you, let me put it this way, it seems to me there's two kinds of risk. There's the risk of style and finding style, and there's the risk in material. And there's different kinds of risks there. Can we control it? If we have big feelings around it, do we want to say this? Do we want to make art out of this? So I just wonder if maybe we start there. I'm going to ask a couple questions and we'll open to the audience.
I can start. Well, I think we both suffer from extreme earnestness.
Terminal
earnestness, which I think is related to this question, where, I mean, it seems to me that I feel most motivated to write by feelings that are really pretty profound. That's not to say I'm not drawn to write about banality, to use your word, but I think the sort of engine of art making for me is these reckoning with kind of unanswerable things and moments of extremity, extreme desire, extreme love, extreme grief. And it feels, I think I feel a certain kind of like fidelity to that, the reality of that and the scope of that only warrants something that's risky, right? Like I have like an ethical obligation, I think, to my experience as a person to offer something that has real stakes for me, perhaps. And I think there's the question of subject and the question of style. I think for my book, it's absurd to say, perhaps, but actually writing in a kind of traditional form or a sort of stodgy form, that actually felt like a risk for a couple of reasons. One, that there's a bunch of connotations attached to these received forms. There's a kind of ideological conservatism that we have married to formal conservatism, right? Which I don't feel a part of at all. But I think also committing to a form for over 100 pages, like, is a little embarrassing. It's risky in a different way, where there's like, there's a kind of like, hope you like it, you know, like here's me really, you know, I'm not hedging by like throwing a free verse, you know, poem in there, or a sonnet, or and that's not to say the book has kind of prose vignettes, but they too are operating within a kind of couplet logic. But so I think that felt like a risk too. So I'm writing, but again, I felt like I was writing, when I was writing this book, into a sort of urgent set of experiences that, and I write about this a little bit in the book, but that also necessitated some kind of urgent form. And for me, the lyric poem, perhaps just like the familiarity of it, and the seeming kind of compulsoriness of it in this moment, didn't necessarily feel risky enough, or didn't feel like I was really, I don't know, exposing myself in quite the way that the heroic couplet did, for whatever reason. So it felt, even though it, you know, there are plenty of times throughout history where it would be absurd to say it was risky to like write in a rhyming form, right? It was the opposite for most millennia. But I think there was real risk, and I wanted to do something that had the potential to embarrass me.
Well, there's that amazing moment in one of the poems you read where you talk about a before and after that is couched as a kind of autobiographical experience of falling in love with this woman. That one of the shibboleths there, the befores and afters, that before you wrote poems in the prevailing style, right? Or the speaker, I should say, not you, Maggie, having another shibboleth. But that style not being, right, her couplets.
That's right.
Garth, do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, so, I mean, I guess risk is really at the center of what I think of as kind of meaningful art making. And this is actually a big conflict for me. It's the big conflict between, you know, my sense of what art is and what art is for, and also my sense of education and one's responsibilities as an educator. Because, you know, I mean, I think that, and I want to say anything, like art is always bigger than anything we can say about it. So nothing I'm saying is like a programmatic belief about all art. But I do think the art that has been most important to me, most transformative for me, is art that, in a quite risky and dangerous way, throws itself into an abyss. And, you know, very often reading student work, you know, if a student is trying to write about something real, which lots of times, all of us, when we're writing drafts, we're not writing about something real, and there it's just sort of like, well, keep writing until you stumble upon reality. But like if a student is trying to write about something real, but you know, the draft is pallid or weak or, you know, staying on the surface, I mean, the only true advice you could say is you need to throw yourself into the abyss. But the thing is, if you throw yourself into an abyss, there's never any guarantee you get to come out. And I think one's first obligation as an educator is to keep one's students safe. And there is a real limit to the extent that I think in my institutional settings, I can teach art making, because I will never tell a student, do the thing that makes you unsafe. And we have really rejected a kind of romantic model of the heroic artist. And I think there are good reasons to question that model. and maybe it's not as useful as we thought it was. But you know, when I think about the writer, the living writer who's most important to me, who's the poet Frank Bedart, for 50 years, Frank Bedart has been throwing himself into the abyss and writing poems about what he discovered there. I think that's a service to art, it's a service to humanity, and I think it is something that has again and again put himself at risk. I mean, the history of art is full of people who didn't come back. And I mean, I do think, you know, and you can sort of say that's a self-aggrandizing sense of the artist. It doesn't really feel so, like the experience of it is not glamorous. But I do think when I'm writing well, there's something very scary. Yeah. And you don't always know where the abyss is. Yeah. You know, I mean, there's, in Cleanness, the central chapter is called The Frog King. And in it, I gave myself the task of writing a happy story. Because these two characters who are very much in love and who are treated quite roughly elsewhere in the book, I wanted to write a kind of idyll that would show, you know, what is valuable in this love between them, not just what's difficult. And there's a scene, the kind of climax of that is a kind of abortive sex scene where the narrator like thinks he's being cute and like starts to sort of kiss his lover's body and cover his lover's body with kisses as a prelude to sex. And he has this idea, I'm going to just like kiss every inch of his body, which like sounds sexy. But he realizes pretty early on, he's like, wait a minute, like, this is actually kind of work. Like, wow. It's actually, you know, bodies are big and lips are small. And there's a moment where he realizes, where he sort of hangs fire, in that Jamesian phrase. He says, am I really going to commit to this? And at that moment, I remember very clearly writing that scene. At that moment, I was asking myself the same question, am I really going to commit to that? Because I realized this is going to take me someplace I wasn't expecting to go.
Yeah.
And in fact, you know, that story about happiness was like the most devastating thing I ever, you know, I did not expect that. But, you know, I realized that in this moment of plenitude, of what I thought was, you know, real joy between these characters, there was an abyss there. I mean, it's that Keatsian, you know, I don't believe in craft lectures except for yours tomorrow. Like, I don't believe in craft lectures except for Keats's Ode on Melancholy, in which he says, you know, and joy whose hand is ever at his lips bidding adieu. And like that sense that like, oh no, actually, right, the abyss is in any profound human experience. You know, it's not just about sadness, it's also an experience of joy.
Yeah. I believe it's that poem. I could be getting the odes mixed up where there's the grape being burst on the palate.
Absolutely,
right?
palate fine on a palate
right,
fine.
The pleasure, but also the burst, the rupture.
Burst joy's grape upon the palate fine.
I'm going to ask, I have so many questions, but I want to give our audience time to ask a couple questions, and then we're going to move to our reception where hopefully you can come and ask more questions. But I mean, since there are, I think, a lot of students in the room, a lot of students of writing, certainly students of reading, I was so profoundly affected by both your readings. Maggie, I've read your book several times. Garth, that was new to me. You know, one of the really challenging things as artists is that in your terminology, Garth, we're trying to, I don't know if we're trying to go to the abyss, but we're trying to make contact, right, with something really important. To create that contact on the page for the reader actually also requires quite a lot of technical skill. And I heard so much technical skill in both of your work, in pivots, right? Pivots that take us from scene to thinking and reflection. That's incredibly hard to master itself or to learn itself. What's also, though, the case in both of those pieces is that there's so much thinking in both of what you read, so much reflection that is kind of baked in. And
I wanted to ask about where that comes in the writing for you. You know, is that actually the act of writing brings the thinking in, the act of form and constraint and restraint allows thinking to happen? You know, are you always going somewhere you didn't know you were going to go? Or do you know where you're going and then there's smaller discoveries along the way? That's a reductive way of putting it. But just could you each describe a little bit how you think about thinking on the page, in fiction, in poetry?
Yeah. Nice sweatshirt.
Oh, yeah. Not a setup. I wasn't planning to ask that question until you both. Until you both thought. Wasn't planning it.
No, I think I do both things. I think sometimes I'm approaching the poem as a conveyance to get me to a thought I've already had, and those are bad poems. Those are the poems that fail. And then I think sometimes I'm coming to the poem with something much more inchoate, bringing me there or pushing me there. I'm invited to the page by something other than certainty, and I'm writing, I think, I'm writing often. I mean, in this book in particular, I think as I'm thinking, that's not to say that, so I think the couplet form also produces a certain kind of thought, right? So different forms also produce different kinds of thinking. Right. There's prose passages, as I said, which I think of in this book as kind of hypermetrical poetic lines. I think that feels very experientially true when I'm reading someone like Garth. Those stories feel to me like long poetic lines that the shape of the page happens to make into rectangular paragraphs, but they're propelled. There's so much continuity of thought, and there's so much fluency between the sort of conjunction of one thought to another is so fluent.
Well, we should say Garth
was a poet.
Is
a trained poet.
Has
yeah,
poems
right.
that he won't let us
Right.
read.
Actually, we published one in the Yale Review.
Yeah.
It's in
Andy
our
McClatchy.
archive. It's in our archive. Yeah, we'll talk after about.
It's a big moment when the Yale Review finally took a poem. Yeah.
Yeah, that was before our time, but we'll
have to explore.
we are honored still. But yeah, no, I mean, I think part of the joy of writing in the couplet, or part of what I became addicted to, was the kind of syntax that this form necessitated, right? So if I know that I need to find a rhyme every 10 syllables or so, right? These are not super metrical lines, but there's this idea of kind of a sense of provisional closure to a thought, right? That happens at the end of every line, or at least that rhyme suggests a kind of provisional closure. So I'm moving from, as much kind of sonically as I am perhaps semantically, at least at the ends of the lines, right? And the kinds of sentences that those formal dictates produce are different from the sentences I would write in prose. And for the kinds of questions that I felt I was asking or coming to the page to kind of muddle through, this form felt really conducive. Like, I just felt like my sentences, the sort of equipment of my own brain was really amenable to working out these questions in sentences that broke in certain places, but that also, enjammed themselves across these kind of sonic linkages. And most of the sentences are pretty long and multi-clausal, but that's part of that thinking on the page. But the thought can't really get so far away from me, which I think is the risk in my writing often, is that I start at point A and I write kind of into some, you know, into some perhaps totally orthogonal corner or something, but but actually, like, if I have to find a rhyme, I'm still pretty connected, right, to the thing that came before, to the preceding thought. There's some attention I'm kind of paying to the most recent articulation I've made. And so, yeah, so I think form has everything to do with thinking, right? And I think thinking on the page is so connected to the kinds of, the kinds of constraints and the kinds of pressures we apply to it, right? And then we can produce thoughts that really surprise us because of the machinery we've put in place.
Which is somewhat delicious, if scary.
Yes, yeah.
Yes. Garth?
Yeah, what was it? I mean, Auden has that wonderful quote that I never remember word for word, but about, like, you know, Lord bless all sort of metrical devices that save us from first thoughts.
Yeah.
You know, and like, I feel so strongly. So I feel really strongly that I know next to nothing before I start writing. And that, I mean, also just in general, full stop. But that, like, you know, that I think of, like, I say this a lot and I really believe it, that sentences for me are not containers for thought, but tools for thinking. That the sentence's syntax generates the thought. And when I am writing, I feel very strongly that my will is in conversation with some other will or some other force. Now, I'm not a theist. I don't think, like Milton, that the Holy Spirit is whispering to me. But I do think, and I think a lot about, like, well, what is that? And in poetry, it's really helpful. You know, I mean, Derek Walcott has a beautiful line somewhere where he sort of says, you know, rhyme, which is language folding, you know, the beloved world in its hand, in its palms or something. You know, like, rhyme is very clearly an instance where, and metrical form in general, poetic form in general, where language is thinking. Like, language, you know, language is exerting a pressure on your thought that is restrictive but also generative. You know, when I think of one of my top 10 poems of all time, Auden's Lullaby, you know, lay your sleeping head, my love human, on my faithless arm. Time and fevers burn away, something from thoughtful children, and the grave proves the child ephemeral. That first rhyme, love, rhymes with grave. The poem ends, these are not contiguous lines, but watched by every mortal love, find our human world enough. The whole argument of that poem is how to transform the rhyme love grave to love enough. Like, how to turn grave into enough. That's rhyme thinking. That's not Auden thinking, that's rhyme thinking. And, you know, and then I think a lot about, well, how does prose do that? Because, you know, I feel, and one thing is syntax. And, you know, I'm very drawn to sort of kind of extravagant syntactical, you know, possibilities in English. But actually, I mean, English is like a remarkably restricted language syntactically for all sorts of fascinating historical reasons. And it is simply the case that with every word, I mean, if in one sense, sort of before you've put a word down on the page, you have sort of a field of possibility. With every word you put on the page, that possibility is radically restricted until, you know, just in terms of like what part of speech could arrive now, you know, it's as though there's like an inevitability, and then much of sort of the drama of writing becomes, do I want here the pleasure of inevitability fulfilled? Or do I want the pleasure of escape and surprise and the sentence turning somewhere new? And then the other way that I think something more than me is thinking in my work, and I really do believe that if an artist is working well, what they are making is smarter than they are. Which is one reason why I don't think works of art should be judged by their makers. Like, it seems unfair because there's more in a work of art than just its maker. But also, you know, the literary traditions to which one has apprenticed oneself. And so, you know, the fact that I spent my entire 20s reading 17th century prose, or poems and devotional prose, and then all of my 30s reading Henry James. Like that, like, you know, certain syntactical patterns are magnetized for me. And so when I am writing, trying to feel the energy of the sentence, that energy is informed by, propelled by this literary tradition in which I'm working.
Yeah.
And so that tradition is thinking in the writing as well. And so, you know, in that sense, I mean, I do think so much of art making is unconscious because, like, the only thing you can know when you're making art is what gives you pleasure. And, like, the whole point of an education, of an artistic education, is to try to develop the most capacious and complex and difficult sense of pleasure possible. So that pleasure is not just eating a donut. Pleasure is also, you know, climbing that mountain that might kill you. You know, the Yeatsian fascination with what's difficult, that you try to cultivate that sense of pleasure and then to have apprenticed yourself to these aesthetic traditions, to, you know, the best that has been done in your medium and also outside of your medium, to sort of have apprenticed yourself so passionately to that, such that your sense of pleasure or satisfaction can be some real meaning, can have some real meaning, can sort of, you know, be a compass that is magnetized towards some true north. You know, that's an aesthetic education. And then you hope that, you know, I don't, as a prose writer, count syllables, although my work is full of iambic pentameter in weird ways, because the only really useful writing advice I ever got was from James Longenbach, God bless his soul. My first poetry teacher who made me give up music and devote my life to poetry, and he said, if you are serious, you will spend 2 years doing nothing but writing blank verse and scanning every line of Paradise Lost. And I was the kind of student who I said, okay. And I don't think I scanned but I scanned hundreds and hundreds of lines of Paradise Lost, and I did spend 2 years just writing blank verse, and so those rhythms are just in my DNA. And so I don't count syllables, but the syllables are counting themselves in some way, you know? And that that's sort of preparing the loam. And then, you know, you try in some sense to be very alive to what is unconscious, very alive to what is not your will, you know, and then it becomes very mysterious how it happens.
We could continue this conversation for so long. There's so much in what you've just said that is thrilling and amazing to me and correlates to my sense of the preparation we do as writers by reading, so that we lay the ground for our unconscious.
Absolutely.
And then the work we do to let it work through us in some sense. I hate to dangle a promise and break it, but our managing editor has told me we're very over time. So we are going to go to our reception upstairs, and I encourage you to ask questions there before our reception ends, because we're so over time. But I want to thank you both for the gift, really the gift of your work.